One. And we are recording with Mr. Jeff Nyquist on Monday, October 30th, 2023 at 2:58 p.m. Eastern time. We were catching up because it's been a while since I had you on, and we're going back and forth, and you were making some points, and I was listening, and then at one point I finally stopped, and I was like, I need to record this. And then you didn't know we weren't recording. I just feel like such an asshole, but we're going to pick up right from there because it was brilliant. But guys, please go into the description. Please go to his website, grab his books, follow him on Twitter. Do you want to just pick up from where we're going? You're basically talking about the Iron Triangle and the different modus operandi of
Yeah,
keeping a
well,
corrupt shithole government going.
you were talking about how everybody's so pessimistic
Yeah.
about what's happening, and my reaction was that actually things are much better than I thought they would be. And of course, I'm the person who has been for more than 30 years warning that look, Russia and China are really together. People, you have not understood communism. It is very flexible. It can change its shape. It's a shapeshifter. It has been evolving. It evolved from Marx to Lenin, from Lenin to Gramsci and others, and to this wokeism we have here, and to the form it takes in China and Russia, the Novorussia and so on. And what we see in Latin America, where it's coming to power everywhere in Latin America, what happened in South Africa with the ANC taking power, and Laurent Kabila's revolution in the Congo, communist revolution in the Congo, and of course, the sort of fake democratization of the MPLA in Angola and in Namibia and so on, where all these Nepal became a communist country, Nicaragua's back under Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas, Cuba's still there, North Korea's got nuclear weapons. I mean, everything got worse except in Eastern Europe, right? And except that now we have Slovakia had elections, and they're now really with Putin. And we know Hungary already was with Putin, and they had the elections in Poland. And I don't care what Tusk says, they're not really going to be friends or helpful to Ukraine. They're going to do what minimum they have to do, but they're going to stick the knife in the back of Ukraine and twist it, I think. Because I don't trust when you get outside the party that has been ruling Poland, the conservatives, which is the largest party in Poland, by the way. When you get to the other parties, I think that they're full of Russian agents. And I think that's been true for a while. When they discovered around 2007 that Polish military intelligence was a nest of Russian spies that were indeed involved in Poland's political parties manipulating them. And the same thing you'll find in Romania, as well as Hungary, all the former East, I think in Czechia. And you've got these politicians, you have like Walesa, who was outed by a former secret police officer in Poland as an agent of the communist secret police, which is mind-blowing. But remember, communism always operated in its territory with a controlled opposition. The first thing you did in the KGB is you infiltrated the people that were against the Soviet system, and you arrested some, and the people that didn't get arrested, they were your stool pigeons. They were your guys that were leading the opposition for you, and the same thing, you go to Václav Havel. I spoke to some of Václav Havel's school buddies back years ago, guys that when he says, he was always a communist. When he was in jail, he had caviar and luxury furniture in his jail cell. He was a kind of a fake dissident. He wasn't, it was interesting to talk to some of these rather famous Czech dissidents who had managed to get out of the country, who knew him, knew his girlfriend, knew his first wife, Václav Havel. So this is in, of course, Robert Buchar, my friend, who made And Reality Be Damned. He made this book and a documentary film. He was a film producer. He'd been a cinematographer for the office of the Czech communist president in the 1970s. But when he defected to the West, he realized that the changes in Czechoslovakia in 1989 were ordered from Moscow. And in fact, he interviewed STB, Czech secret police guys, who were given the order from Moscow, we're going to have a Velvet Revolution. We're going to bring in Václav Havel. And so he interviewed these guys. He made a documentary showing that Moscow engineered the revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, just in the same way that Andrei Codrescu, the Romanian defector in America, wrote his book, The Hole in the Flag, showing how the overthrow of Ceausescu came from Moscow. That overthrow of Ceausescu in December of 1989 was engineered from Moscow. And so this hidden history of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, how there was this massive deception, how the secret police were really behind it, has never been told. And the other thing that was hidden from everybody was that a KGB defector named Anatoly Golitsyn, Major Anatoly Golitsyn, who defected in December of 1961, and who, by the way, Alfred Hitchcock made a movie about that defection called Topaz, revealed this massive penetration of Western intelligence, penetration at the top of French intelligence, penetration of the British political system, penetration of the CIA. And this was really bad news, and people didn't want to believe it. But Golitsyn had talked about, they mocked it. The people who opposed Golitsyn called it the monster plot. They made fun of it. He said, look, there's this long-range plan. They were reorganizing the KGB in the late 1950s to carry out this plan with controlled opposition. They were going to create a controlled anti-communist movement to create a fake liberalization. And he said, basically, after Brezhnev, they're going to have a liberalizing Soviet leader. Well, you had Chernenko and Andropov briefly after Brezhnev, but then you had Gorbachev, a liberalizing Soviet leader. And Gorbachev's liberalization, according to Golitsyn, was prepared decades in advance. The plan was invented in the late 50s by a secret committee led by Leonid Brezhnev. And that's how Brezhnev got to be the head of the system. And Brezhnev, this book is fascinating. This is Vizla Saraska's brilliant How the Soviet Union Disappeared. And she basically pointed out that Brezhnev had this, the Soviet Union was governed by this iron triangle. And it was the party, the army, and the KGB. And the party had its administrative organs watching the KGB, and they had their commissars in the army watching the army, and the KGB had its guys watching the army. So they had this system of guys with guns at the back of each other's heads to control everything. Lenin had kind of ingeniously set it up this way. But what Brezhnev did is continuing that. He had given the army the task of preparing for a future nuclear war, and then he put them sort of in competition with the KGB, which was setting up the task of organizing for this future fake liberalization of the Eastern Bloc with controlled opposition movements that could make it look like they were changing, but they weren't. So the West would drop its guard, stop making nuclear weapons or get rid of their nuclear weapons, and then the Soviet Union would emerge along with China as its buddy, a renewed communist bloc, and they would say, stick them up, and we got all the missiles and we got the stuff, so we'd stick them up. And you can see right now this talk out of China about war, this talk in Russia about war, this Russian general over the weekend saying, oh, we're not stopping after Ukraine, get ready for a wild ride, right? And they've had these kind of little side comments coming out of Russia all this while. You had Dmitry Medvedev, the former president who had that little term as president between Putin's two set terms, and he had made the statement that we're restoring the Soviet Union, and we're gonna unify Europe. We're gonna own all of Europe. And he and other Soviet officials, former Soviets, Russian officials saying, it's from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We're going to own everything. And it was funny because Gorbachev had said the same thing in a different way. In Gorbachev's book, Perestroika, he said, he talked about our one common European home. And he said from Brest, that's in France, that's a little tip of France that sticks out, from Brest to Vladivostok. And then Drunken Boris said from all the way across Canada, Vladivostok to Vancouver. Didn't include the United States, by the way, because according to the defector Stanislav Lunev, the United States was to be handed over to China when the final victory came. When China, General Chiao Chen's secret speech, General Chiao Chen wanted to basically make a second China. He said, we have to kill off all the Americans and make a second China and move hundreds of millions of Chinese into the lower 48 states. And of course, this is how you get that highway the Chinese built between Ensenada and San Diego, Ensenada and Tijuana. This Swedish Mexican podcaster rode the highway and did a podcast. You can find it on YouTube, where he talks about talking to the Mexican contractors who built the highway, how the Chinese said, oh yeah, this is going to be our invasion highway into the US. Right? We're going to land in Ensenada, the troops and the tanks, and then we're just going to march up the highway and go to San Diego.
Jesus.
So it's and of course you've got Scott Gulbranson's book, which I have here somewhere. Scott Gulbranson was a Las Vegas journalist who went down to Tijuana, befriended a Tijuana policeman who took him down and introduced him to fishermen who said 20 plus years ago, they were offloading, Ensenada is a port controlled by the Chinese, that the Chinese freighters were offloading weapons secretly at night in Ensenada, shipping them and depositing them in depots inland in Mexico. And that some of these weapons were being smuggled into the United States as secret depots. And now we have an open border, and thousands of Chinese military-age men are coming across the border illegally. Are they going to those secret depots where all those arms have been laid down? Right? I mean, so you could create a Chinese army inside the United States if you take 20 years to prepare secretly the places where you would, and this reminds me of a conversation I had with Colonel Stanislav Lunev. He was a GRU defector. He defected in March of 1992. He worked for the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff. And he said, I said, well, what is this about? I read the Russian military literature, and they don't directly state it, but it's implied that you're going to invade the United States. So how does that work? And he said, oh, well, we used Hitler's invasion of Norway as a model. So how did Hitler invade Norway? Well, the Germans had created secret arms and uniform stockpiles in Norway before the war. So the Brandenburg Regiment, which Lunev talked about, the Russians were very excited about this idea. They came into Norway as tourists. They would go to these depots, put on their uniforms, and they get their weapons, and they would go and grab airports and port facilities, so that when the German heavy weapons arrived, whether it was, used mostly artillery, tanks, and things like that, they could offload them, and they'd have the ports controlled. They could offload the weapons, and they could just, the country was just open to invasion. There was no, there's no real beaches inside of some of the fjords there. There's not really Normandy-style beaches. The Germans didn't land in Norway the way the Allies landed in Normandy. They just came right into major ports, and they grabbed them through this infiltration method, and opened the airports, and the mountain troops and the paratroopers flew in. So the idea was that you could infiltrate the United States, which doesn't have particularly good security inside the country. You could grab these ports and airfields, and suddenly you could flood the country with all these troops. And it's you probably heard about the incident in Texas. This was a couple of years back, where that economic fellow, he found it, and he talked to the Texas legislature. What it was is there was this billionaire Chinese general who had this huge wind farm in Texas.
Yeah.
Remember that? And they were building a 10,000-foot runway in Texas, this Chinese general. So what do you need a 10,000-foot runway at a wind farm in Texas for? Well, what did 10,000-foot runways accommodate? Well, these super huge planes that can carry tanks and artillery and troops in large numbers. So it's like, well, this all kind of it fits like a puzzle, right? And that's the thing that's just, the more you know, the more you look at the sources, the more you see there's this plan. And Lunev said, yeah. He said, the last time I was with the general staff in, I guess it was early 1992, they said, look, the nuclear, now the Soviet Union's collapsed. The nuclear war plan on America is still on. Only the Chinese we're going to invade Alaska and parts of Canada, and the Chinese are going to provide the troops for invading the lower 48. They're going to have that. That's going to be their territory, with other countries invited for looting rights. Well, a couple of years later, after I hear this from Lunev, he told me this in February of 99, and I'd met him for the first time in August of 98. Well, then a couple of years later, it turns out Chiao Chen, the Chinese defense minister, gives this secret speech, which gets out, the Epoch Times translated into English, in which he says, look, we have made this deal with the Russians for land in the north, that we're going to get the lower 48 states, and that we need to exterminate all the people living in the lower 48 states because we're going to make a second China there. So you see, the weird thing is, when you collect enough of these bits of information, what you're doing is you're actually assembling this plan, this military plan. My friend Nevin Gusek has written a book about Russian and Chinese future military plans versus the United States, and there's a lot that we don't have, but it's rather remarkable what they've got in store in mind to do to us. And so it's very alarming then when Putin in 2018 gives this great extravaganza where he is literally saying, here's all the new secret weapons I got. I've got the little robot mini submarine with the 200 megaton tsunami bomb that can wipe out a whole city with a giant tidal wave, and he's got laser weapons, and he's got hypersonic missiles, and on and on. He's got all these fabulous new weapons, and he's showing it off. But here's the good news. Okay, so we're talking. This sounds very dark, right? And the big question is, why hasn't it happened yet? It's not like we're wide awake here that anybody hears. We got all these lefties in Congress that want to cut out the nuclear arsenal. They're literally insane. It's like all these people want to commit suicide. It's like the gays for Hamas, right? This is like, I'm a suicidal nut.
Yeah.
I'm for the people who want to kill me. And so there's this impulse. So, but the good news is this, I was telling you before when we were chatting before the show about this wonderful old book. It's old now because it was in the 90s, Russia's Secret Rulers by Lev Timofeyev. And here's a picture of Lev back here. And the guy that wrote the afterword of this book has this absolutely brilliant essay. His name is Anton Kozlov. And of course, what Timofeyev is debating in there is he's saying, what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union? The same rotten people are still in charge, and they've created this sort of mafia, gangster state. And so who's in charge? Are the gangsters in charge, or is the old communist structure still in charge? And of course, when you look at it closely, you realize he's kind of, I don't know what he would say. You get the idea that he's trying to make up his mind, and he kind of says, he goes, some people are going to say the gangsters are in charge, others are going to say, look, it's the old system, it's still in charge. The only thing that really makes sense is that the old system's still in charge, because who has all the levers of power? Who really has the power in a police state? Not the criminals, the police. If they're using the criminals, they can have them arrested tomorrow. It's not like there's a Bill of Rights in Russia. The police routinely torture people in Russia. A lot of people don't know that, but they torture people for confessions. It's very medieval there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the criminals are just And the criminals do have blackmail on the police, and they're paying the police money, and they're making the police money. But here's what the good news is. What I was telling you about. What Kozlov says is this iron triangle, this system, this Russian system, it had an element that Stalin and Lenin had discovered that made it work, and it was terror, right? And the terror is not just applied to anti-communists or people who oppose the regime. The terror is applied to the administrative staff that's running the government, running the economy. Remember, it's state capitalism. And what it is Stalin's purges. Stalin sees these people have a tremendous, in the Soviet economy, you're an administrator, you have access to all this wealth in it. What is going to keep you from stealing? What is going to keep you honest? Well, being arrested and shot, and the fact that people at the administrative level are arrested and shot all the time. By the time you get to World War II, the age of the average high-level Soviet administrator had dropped because all the older people were being killed. So you had talent could rise very fast, as long as they were honest and they didn't get caught if they were dishonest. So yes, there was still corruption in the Soviet system, but because of the fear that Stalin created with his terror, there was less corruption, and it functioned. Okay, so they lied about how many tanks they made at the beginning of World War II, so that when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, Stalin's tank brigades were only half full. But he had, the glass is half full, not half empty. But when you look at Putin, now what happened to get rid of the terror when Stalin is dead and Khrushchev denounces him in 1956 in his secret speech, they get rid of the terror mechanism. They said, oh, well, we're communists. We're going to be lovey-dovey with each other. We're not going to murder each other anymore. We're just going to murder the anti-communists. We're not going to murder other communists. Not realizing this was the secret ingredients, the secret sauce in the Soviet system under Stalin. And I told you the joke about the train, the Soviet Union being a train. And Stalin's on the train and it stops moving. And so they say, Comrade Stalin, what do we do? Shoot the engineers, shoot these people, bring in new people, and the train's moving again. Khrushchev comes in, the train stops. They say, what do we do? Bring back the jailed engineers. Don't shoot them, just bring back the jailed ones, and then the thing moves again. Then they bring Brezhnev comes on the train, and the train stops moving. And they say, Comrade Brezhnev, what do we do? And he says, just pull down the curtain and pretend we're moving, right? So this is kind of what happened. They got rid of the terror. And what Kozlov says is you get rid of the terror, the secret sauce, and the system becomes corrupt. It starts to rot because these people up here start getting comfortable. They start stealing. They develop hyper incompetencies, hyper dysfunction within the Soviet economy, within the production system. And so what ends up happening is what we see under Putin. Because Putin, although he came in and he changed out a lot of people and he threatened people and he jailed a lot of oligarchs and murdered some oligarchs, did it differently than Stalin. Stalin would have them charged with crimes, with wrecking or being Western agents or something, or British spies, but he would just have gangsters shoot them. If you're going to use the mafia, we don't need a trial. We don't need to go through all that monkey business. We just have them shot. Have them shot in the elevator outside their apartment. Have their car blown up in a car bomb. Have an aircraft go down with them on it. And so they were just murdering businessmen like crazy in Putin's Russia. And of course, the problem was as Putin got older, as he and his cronies got more comfortable, the stealing, whereas Stalin could fill half a tank brigade, when they went to make the first guard tank armies, and they were supposed to put these new Armada tanks in it, they didn't have enough Armada tanks to make a regiment, which is basically about 100 tanks. So I don't think they have that many functioning Armada tanks, some maybe 50, 60, 70. So they were supposed to build whole tank armies, a first guards tank army, a second guard, So what happened? So you hear these stories that, they set up all these arms plants in Russia, and they were going to pay people great, and they were going to make it work. And the people went to work there thinking, oh, this is going to be a great job. And the people didn't get paid. Where did the money go? They worked for a while. Well, we're tired of working for nothing or getting half pay or whatever they were doing at this or that plant. So the plants just sat there without anybody in them, without activity. And this is the question some of us have is, did anybody tell Putin? The tank brigades weren't half empty. They were 90% empty. To right now, according to statistics I've read, Russia can build about 3,000 tanks a year, but they're T-64s.
Yeah.
They're tanks that they were making, in the 1960s and early 70s. So, so this problem of corruption, and of course, you have this, I've spoken to this one Russian oligarch. I don't want to name him. I don't want to get him in trouble. But the idea was, the rumors were that the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and some of the people around him, not clear on who exactly, had stolen $30 billion of procurement money. I mean, there's greed and then there's greed, right?
Yeah.
But then if you're stealing, it's not just one person stealing, right? Because to make this work, to not get caught, it's almost like a mafia thing. You have to have a large number of people profiting, so that if anybody decides to report on them, you can just murder them. Because everybody's let's look, you took the money too. Here, I'm giving you this money. What is this money for? I'll tell you later. Oh, I love the money. Thank you. Then later on, the guy comes to you and says, do you know that people are stealing? Oh, well, that money you got? You're stealing too. So if you rat on us, you're going down too, right? So they compromise everybody, because after all, the system of lying and cheating and sneaking around and conspiring, this is what Kozlov says. Lenin was the ultimate conspirator. He believed capitalism was a conspiracy, imperialism was a conspiracy, World War I was a conspiracy. So he believed everything was a conspiracy. He made a political party, the Communist Party, that was a conspiracy. The Soviet Union was a conspiratorial country. They wanted to take over the world by a giant global communist conspiracy. And he said the problem is, when you eliminate the terror from the formula of the conspiracy, you get a counter conspiracy. To do what? Let's steal $30 billion from the Soviet system. And that's not the only thing that got stolen from, under Putin. So then Putin, who thinks he has this Guards tank army, thinks he has all these fabulous weapons. He thinks that the S-400 anti-air, anti-missile system can stop a HIMAR rocket. Those rockets that have been devastating the Russians by destroying all their howitzer depots, their howitzer ammunition depots. Well, they thought that the S-400 anti-aircraft system could shoot those rockets down. Well, lo and behold, they couldn't. They had no defense against the HIMARS. Why? Because the promises made by the defense contractors, they made a defective product. Why? Because, well, they were taking some of the money, making claims for the product that weren't true. So this explains, you've got, I know you've heard, Tommy, the people like Colonel Douglas McGregor, or the convicted child molester Scott Ritter, right? You've heard them give the Russian, Russia's wiping out Ukraine. Ukraine has suffered, 400,000 casualties. The Ukrainians are done, and day 10 of the war, Colonel Douglas McGregor was saying it's 10 more days and it's over. And here it is, it's more than a year and a half later. The Russians just lost a horrible battle at Avdiivka trying to attack the Ukrainians. Just hundreds of vehicles destroyed, thousands and thousands of men killed, and it was a disaster here when the Russians started attacking again here in the fall. And so what does McGregor have to say for himself? He gets on with Tucker Carlson. He basically says all these Russian lies because, see, Russia wants everybody to think they're winning when they're losing. And they're losing. One military analyst, John Mosier, has a little commentary that he makes, and he thinks there could be as many as 500,000 Russian casualties now, dead and wounded, We don't know the numbers, of course, he would tell you that. But I mean, you look at what we know, the vehicles they've counted, the ratios of mechanized to infantry forces, and you look at these numbers because they can count wrecked vehicles from satellites.
Sure.
Russia's suffered tremendous losses in this war, and I think the losses are 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, maybe as much as 5-1 what the Ukrainians are losing, because the Ukrainians have better medical treatment for their soldiers. A lot of Russians die because they don't have the better medical attention to their wounded soldiers. And their officers use these World War I tactics. I mean, World War II tactics, rather, which are like World War I tactics.
Oh, World
where
War
they,
One, the trenches.
Yeah, well, they have, well, World War II had trenches too, where they have masses of tanks and vehicles and men, and they just march right into the enemy line and try to blast their way in. And now, in 1950s, there was a firepower revolution. Modern weapons are more effective than modern conventional weapons are, 2 to 3 times more effective than World War II weapons in terms of their accuracy, their hitting power, in terms of vehicles. And so you come into range of those weapons and you could really get wiped. And so attacking is just really dangerous. You have to prepare the attack with the proper artillery strikes. You need air superiority to disrupt the enemy's communications, to demoralize him. This is like what we did when we invaded Iraq. Remember, we had this shock and awe, and it just totally disrupted the Iraqis, and we just blew holes in their lines, and so the Iraqi army just ran away at one point. That is not, they weren't able to do that to Ukraine's army. And the Ukraine's army operates more effectively than the Russian army. And the troops are better treated and better motivated. So there's this disaster. So this is good news, because you might ask why. Ukraine has been independent on paper, independent from Moscow since 1991. They finally threw off the Russian KGB puppets that were ruling them in the 2014 Euromaidan revolution, and they tried their own government. They're new at this. They've been really controlled by this Soviet corruption secret police system, and they're new at this, and they're infiltrated too, just like we are, because that's what the Russians infiltrate everybody. But it was they're able to stand up to them. But what the world, so this is good news, because why now? Why is Moscow trying to take back Ukraine now? And I think it's because China's economy, China knew in 2020, 2019, they knew their economy because of what President Trump had done in the trade talks, backed him into a corner. They're so dependent on this trade relationship where they were basically gutting us with they're basically, lowering their currency below its real value, dumping goods on our markets to destroy our own domestic industry so that they could, get control of the markets here in the US. I mean, everything on the shelves, made in China, made in China. They realized that what Trump had damaged them, and they were starting to have problems because they'd have massive malinvestment in China. And according to sources I've had in China, the Chinese Communist Party thought, all right, tell the Russians we probably need to go to war now rather than in 2035, which was the date that people in China were giving to when they thought this future war with America was going to happen. The one that Colonel Lunev talked about. It's going to take us to 2027 to catch up with the Americans and to get ahead of them. And by 2035, we'll have such a superiority over them, we'll just be able to take them. But now with their economy shaky, they thought, well, we better go now. And here Putin has all these wonderful super weapons. And, before the war, Putin flies to Beijing to the Winter Olympics, remember, in February of 2022. And they meet and they declare this partnership that is unlimited partnership between China and Russia. And then Putin flies back to Moscow and then invades Ukraine. Well, he tripped over his own feet. And we know that in We know that in 2022, China, in April, the Communist Party gave an order to mobilize for war. And we have the 57-minute recording of the military civil meeting about mobilizing, about converting ro-ro ships, about mobilizing nearly 1,000 merchant ships to deal with the invasion. And Mr. Wing of Luna Media, who had smuggled this information out of China, told me at the time, he said, if you will remember, that they wanted to go to the second island chain and beyond it, and they would blockade Taiwan and leave it behind. And their real objective was, see, you hear people saying that our economy will collapse if the chip industry in Taiwan is cut off, right? And it will hurt the world economy, but the stuff, we have a high-tech economy. The stuff that would really kill us is if we were cut off from Japan and South Korea. That's what really will kill us. And apparently, what Mr. Wang was saying, that's what the Chinese really want. They want that. And of course, what's really fascinating about that is that if they're able to do that, our economy will, Mr. Wang told me, they think our economy will collapse within a couple of years. You know, because you talk about supply chain issues. You know, it's like you pull certain things out of your economy. Look at everything runs on chips, power plants, factories, you know, all kinds of vehicles, military things, all depend on these high-end chips. And you know, these configured chips, some of them, they could be worth $20,000 or more. You can have $100,000 configured chips. I don't know. When I was in industry, I knew that they were, you know, in 1990s dollars, or you know, thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, goodness knows, I don't know what the highest end chips are. Maybe you know somebody that can tell you, but they're extremely, this is the high end of our economy. And this is where you get, you know, all these computers that everything runs on, and of course robotics, which is the new thing that's coming on. And then but the good news was the Chinese here, this mobilization went out, and on May 11th of 2022, you had that 57-minute meeting in Guangdong, but they had to rescind the order. Why? Because Russia's army got stuck in Ukraine. So what I mean, with military logic, you can deduce from this that Russia expected to fairly quickly move through Ukraine, because they had that plan to surround Kiev, remember? They grabbed the airport behind Kiev with paratroopers, and they were going to fly in troops and tanks into that airport, but they couldn't. They started shooting the planes down, and they had to turn back the airlift. Well, they weren't able to completely encircle Kiev. They weren't able to take the city, and they ended up having to retreat. Terrible defeat, the Battle of Kiev. They were going to kill the whole Ukrainian government. It didn't work. And as a consequence, they didn't collapse Ukraine in the days or weeks that they expected, or even months. Ukraine held on. We can deduce from that their expectation was to bring the whole Russian army with its vast tactical nuclear capability right up to the border of NATO, of Poland and Romania. And once that army was there, they could use tactical nukes then, because they weren't brother Slavs anymore. You're talking about Romanians, you're talking about American airborne and tank divisions there that would be moved up to the border. And then NATO's just not ready for war. Ukraine, Ukraine is now about to reach the production level of producing 10,000 drones a month. Do you think the US can produce 10,000 drones a month? I don't know. I don't know what our capacity is, but Ukraine is impressive what they've done. Ukraine has done a tremendous thing. And of course, so the good news is the plan for World War III got stopped. That's the good news. And these guys are bungling. The Russians just simply, and it's the rot of this system that they don't have another Stalin. They don't have a genius of terror to enforce. They need to go back to the old system if they want to be able to do the old system. But the problem is that would make them, with all the dependence on modern technology, that would make them North Korea, wouldn't it? And how good does North Korea's economy work?
Yeah.
They can't even feed themselves. So it seems like what they're doing, and you look at China and its economic problems. I mean, we know the Chinese growth hasn't just slowed, it's gone into the red. And so the longer they wait, the more likely are that they have to call the whole thing off. Cross your fingers and
Yeah.
hope. But this is the question about, now we go to Hamas. And of course, Hamas is tied into the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians. Of course, the Iranians are totally tied in with the Chinese and the Russians. Why did they do this? There's been these hints. Yeah.
Give me 1 second, Jeff. I'm a little under the weather and I've been crushing these Gatorades, which means I have to use the restroom like every 30 minutes. Jeff, real quick, tell them where to find you. I'll be
you
right
got
back.
this high blood sugar thing where you got to go all the time, huh?
Tell them where to find you.
Time for a commercial break. This book I wrote a couple of years ago, or I published in 2020, actually. And it was actually written a little before that. It's The Fool and His Enemy Toward a Metaphysics of Evil. And you can get it on Amazon. And it's a quick read. It's only about, you can read it in 3 hours. And it's been written to be really easy to understand. And I sort of I write the structure of the situation we're in. It's like I talk about these ideologies that we've been fed to believe, where we accuse ourselves first, where we're the bad guys. We're really fed that all the time. So if something bad happens in the world, it's the CIA, or it's the evil American corporations, the Seven Sisters, the oil companies. Who shot JFK? It was always one of our people. We didn't really land on the moon. Everything is a lie. And of course, the truth is ultimately what sounds exactly like Russian propaganda, communist propaganda. So, and I ask the big question is here, cui bono? What does this system of lies, this wokeness, who does it serve? The system of policies where we're committing suicide with, the way we regard race and sex, and we call ourselves racist and sexist, and we're all divided, and we're all upset with each other, and we've got to fix all these problems. But it's the people that benefit are the communists who were traditionally working with these people. I just did an advertisement for my book, The Fool and His Enemy.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Tie in Hamas to China.
Right. Well, China has, of course, supported Iran. China gets oil from Iran. And of course, let's go back to how Iran formed in its present form. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. As Yosef Bodansky showed in his writings, the Iranian Revolution, the KGB conspired to help put Khomeini in power, because the Shah of Iran was America's ally. The Shah he had American military equipment. He was, when I first was a freshman in college in 1976 at Cal State Northridge, that's where I was a freshman, our classes were full of Iranians, and they spoke English so well. They were so smart, and very impressive young people who were being educated in the United States, learning English, coming from the Shah's Iran. And of course, it was just, 3 years later that this incredible revolution happened in Iran. Now, 3 things happened in 1979 that kind of give you the context for the revolution in Iran. The Soviet Union in December of that year invaded Afghanistan, which is where? Right next to Iran. It's just to the east of Iran. And there were communist Islamists, that is, Islamist radicals, trained in Libya by East Germans and Cubans. East Germany being a communist country, Castro's Cuba being a communist country. They tried to take the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia in 1976. And in other words, to spark a revolution against the Saudi monarchy, a communist revolution under color of being Islamist, Sunni Islamist. So that at the same time, you have this attempted revolution in Saudi Arabia, which would have been disastrous for the West, because Saudi Arabia is this big ally of the West, of the United States. Standard Oil developed the oil, and it was the core of the oil that the West depended on. Japan depended on, Europe depended on. We were even taking Saudi oil at the time. And so, but okay, so the revolution, the communist sponsored Islamist revolution in Saudi Arabia failed, but the one in Iran worked. And if you remember at the time, there was this storming of the US embassy in Iran, where all these Americans were taken hostage in the US embassy. Now, that was before you were born, I think. But it was at the time, it was huge news, because they had taken Americans. And well, what Bodansky shows is that the KGB was involved in that. And Khomeini had relationships with, when he lived in exile in Iraq, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, his Iraqi security detail was trained in the Soviet Union. The Ayatollah Khomeini. And his brother was one of the leaders of the Communist Datuda party in Iran. So here's the Ayatollah, and here's his brother, the Communist Party. It's a very strange, now, of course, the Communist Party, the clerics went after the Communist Party, but the Communist Party, probably the more important people in that party, probably became Muslim at the time and joined the system. And who did they ultimately become allies with? The Soviet Union. Now, the current Ayatollah, he's not Khomeini, he's Khamenei, I think is how you say it. The current Ayatollah went to college at Moscow State University, Patrice Lumumba, Friendship University. So he was educated in the Soviet Union, the current Ayatollah. And what I was told, I mean, you can ask Claire Lopez this, because I think she knows this, because I think she worked the Iranian desk at one time. But and you could ask her this question, but it wasn't just one leader that was educated in the Soviet Union. A lot of these Iraqis were educated, Iraqi leaders now in the leadership cadre were educated in the former Soviet Union. So it makes perfect sense that Iran, and of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini's form of Islam is like a liberation theology form of it. Of course, Islam is in its political doctrine closer to the left, closer to socialism, because it has a lot of socialist-like dogmas in Islam. So this is a natural thing. And then going back to Lenin, when Lenin took power in Russia, his second speech, his first one were to the Russian people, but his second speech were to the Muslim people. And there were lots of Muslims in the Russian Empire, and also to the Muslims beyond, saying that you are our natural ally against imperialism. And this was this appeal. And of course, Joseph Stalin, who was a commissar of nationalities under Lenin during the Civil War, he went out to Central Asia, where all the later they were called Red Muslims or Soviet Muslims, Central Asia, and he got the Red Muslims to join the Soviet Union, the Central Asian republics. And that part of Soviet history, I think, is ignored, and it's not that well understood. So this connection, and of course, China was formed by the Soviet Union, and initially they called it Soviet China, because in 1945, at the end of World War II, after the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, and before Japan surrendered, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, which was held by the Japanese, captured all the Japanese military ordnance in Manchuria, and gave it to Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist. And of course, the Chinese Civil War between the communists, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and the communists had been interrupted by the Japanese invasion of China, but it resumed when World War II ended. And of course, the US tried to force the two parties together, but all they did is basically they disabled the nationalist cause, George Marshall's mission to China. And in 1949, Mao won the Civil War in China. thanks to the bungling of the Truman administration and the work of General George Marshall, China went communist. The largest country in the world, Russia, had gone communist. Now the most populous country in the world, I guess China is no longer the most populous country, but then it was for many years, became communist. And of course, then you had the Korean War in 1950, where you had this big, nasty war in Korea, where 50,000 Americans died. And you had where we were fighting the Chinese, actually. And then you had the Vietnam War. So this whole communist thing was serious. But what they did is the communists realized we were standing up to them. We had NATO, their CETO in Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. We were hemming them in. And so what did they do? Détente, well, peaceful coexistence, détente under Brezhnev. And of course, inevitably, the Sino-Soviet split, with which the defector Colonel Major Anatoly Golitsyn said in his 1984 book, New Lies for Old, that the Sino-Soviet split was a deception.
Hmm.
And this is Nevin Gusak wrote a book called, I think it's Golitsyn Vindicated, about all the evidence that Russia and China, when they were supposedly enemies, were colluding in all these areas. And nobody was noticing this. And he documents that in this book. So that the Sino-Soviet split was exaggerated and probably just used. And there's, the conspiracy and death of Jin Lin Biao kind of shows this too. In 1970, this is what coincided with Kissinger's secret trip to China and Nixon then coming to China, is supposedly there was an attempt by the head of the People's Liberation Army in China to overthrow Mao by creating a fake war with the Soviet Union, getting Mao to go into his bunker and gassing Mao in his bunker. This is the story. So Lin Biao supposedly, when he got caught doing this, he tried to flee to the Soviet Union and his jet was shot down over Mongolia, right? And he was killed. Well, what Colonel Lunev told me was Lunev had a friend that went to the site of the crash in Mongolia, a Soviet GRU guy. And I said, well, what do you know about the conspiracy of Lin Biao? And he said, well, I had a friend at the crash site. Well, what's the story? He said, well, everybody was in that airplane was dead before they were put on the plane. And I said, well, why didn't the Soviet Union say that it was completely a fake incident? That Lin Biao never tried to escape to the Soviet Union. China was just, that was a finger of blame that Mao was pointing at Moscow, saying, Moscow tried to overthrow me. Here, I want to be Nixon's friend, right in 1971. And so, but the real story was it was faked. And I asked Colonel Lunev, I said, why would the Russians go along with this Chinese fake by not announcing to the world that this crash was a fake? Collusion. They were colluding. The Russians wanted the Chinese to sound credible when they blamed Moscow for this. Right? There's all these little telltales. But the problem is people don't read. They don't look at it carefully enough to see. And so I have grave doubts about Henry Kissinger. I think he's 100 years old now, or is he 101?
Yeah, he's 100.
He's 100. I have grave doubts about him and about his trip to China. And just to tell you that General Michael Golanowski, who was a Polish colonel general in Polish military intelligence, communist Poland, back in the 50s, was a British agent, codenamed Sniper. And he got a hold of a list of GRU spies recruited in Germany at the end of World War II. And he memorized this list because he got the list because the guy who shared his office space was another Polish general who had this list in a safe. And this guy died of a heart attack. And Golanowski inherited the safe. So there was a Sergeant Henry A. Kissinger recruited in 1945 listed on this list. And Golanowski told the British, they sent him to tell the Americans But now Kissinger's this very powerful guy in the American national security establishment because Kissinger made him his national security advisor. And if you were in the CIA and you were investigating Kissinger and he found out, you'd lose your head, right? I mean, you would lose your job because Kissinger was that powerful. I mean, Kissinger walked in and out of Nixon's office whenever he wanted.
Yeah.
And there's a funny, H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff, famously. He went to jail for Watergate. If you read H.R. Haldeman's book, there's some interesting things in that book about Kissinger. You know that Haldeman says in the book that when Kissinger would walk into his office, now this is the chief of staff for the president, he would walk around the office and he would try to see what was on Haldeman's desk. He would try to read like he was a spy. He was spying on Haldeman. He was trying to read everything. So Haldeman realized this. And so Haldeman played this game where he'd move things and he would just seem like naturally put things on top of things just to make him lose his mind.
Just to drive him mad.
Haldeman thought this was funny, but it really wasn't funny. Not when you consider, and Haldeman evidently did not know about this accusation from this British spy out of the Polish military intelligence against him. And later they asked the head of American CIA counterintelligence, James Angleton, about this. There's a book on this called Widows, by the way, if people want to read about it. And they asked Angleton, and Angleton said, well, I made a mistake not investigating Kissinger because he certainly looks wrong. And there's other people in the CIA. A guy with the same name as the Star Trek doctor, Leonard McCoy, he was very upset about Kissinger at the end of Kissinger's tenure as Secretary of State. And by the way, Kissinger, there's a book called Henry Kissinger, Soviet Agent. I've got that here somewhere, which is it's written by a police detective. And it's very interesting because it's a biography of Kissinger, and it shows how extremely narcissistic he is. And brilliant, of course, but narcissistic, and pointed out that he appointed a number of people to the State Department who then the FBI said, look, these people are communists or they're communist connected. And they had to boot them out. But he tried to bring in communists into the State Department. This is very incriminating. But what McCoy was upset because we had in late 1976, early 77, just before President Ford, left office and President Carter came in. It was actually in January. Kissinger went to the Soviet embassy in Washington to talk to the Russian ambassador in a prolonged meeting. I think it might have been the Russian foreign minister, but no, it was the Russian ambassador. And McCoy was really concerned because Kissinger had been briefed with intelligence that was from this high-level Russians that we had working for the CIA in Moscow. And he was really afraid that Kissinger would give away in just talking to Anatoly Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador. He was afraid that information would leak and the Russians would arrest and kill the spy. And he wanted to meet with Kissinger and explain to him, look, you can't say this, you can't say that, it's going to give away. And Kissinger just went, and he met with Dobrynin, and hours later, that spy was arrested and disappeared and was probably executed. So McCoy was furious and started to think that Kissinger had done it on purpose. Right? This is in the book Widows as well. But there's a number of these books on Kissinger that are disturbing. And the story of in the book Spycatcher, it tells the story of Michael Golanowski. And what's really weird is when this was playing out, Golanowski suddenly came forward and said, "Oh, I'm the heir of the Romanovs. I'm what did he say? I'm the heir to the imperial throne." And this is so bizarre. And it was in Peter Wright, was the deputy head of MI5. And of course, they were responsible for the security of Golanowski because he had defected to the British. He had been a British spy. And he speculated that that Golanowski was approached by the Russians and told that you have no security. Really, we can get to you, and you better discredit yourself or we will kill you. So this was to discredit himself because, and this was the spy catcher scandal. Peter Wright, as the former deputy head of MI5, that's British counterintelligence, intelligence for the homeland of Britain, he made this huge scandal writing his book Spy Catcher, saying that his boss, Sir Roger Hollis, was a Soviet agent. The head of the equivalent of the FBI in Britain was a Soviet agent. And there's been a number of books since. Chapman Pincher's book, Treason, and of course, a number of other books basically documenting that there was that Sir Roger Hollis had all these communist connections, that Roger Hollis was covering up for communist agents during World War II, that he was facilitating operations of the Stalin networks. And this came out when people started digging once Peter Wright made these accusations. And of course, so you had this mole inside, and of course, you had these same mole hunts going inside at the same time in the CIA. And of course, people said, oh, there's no mole, you know, Angleton and Galitzin and these defectors who say we're full of moles are wrong. And I think I mentioned before the show, there was this famous story that Alfred Hitchcock made into a movie called Topaz, which is about Galitzin's defection, and about some of that information showed that the heads of French intelligence were Soviet agents. And that this book called Lamia, written by Tirade de Vosjoli, was a top French intelligence official. He'd been in the French underground in World War II. And he realized that de Gaulle had sort of cooperated with the communists to get to be the big guy during the liberation of France. He was working in America at the time. And when he got this information, and this is the amazing story, Galitzin had told American intelligence that the French Secret Service, the French intelligence, had been taken over by the KGB and was now spying for the KGB, that their bosses were KGB agents, and that the Russians had given the order to their minions in the French intelligence to gather information on the American nuclear missile forces and nuclear bombers. And de Vosjoli, when he first heard this, when he was first briefed on Galitzin by his CIA friends in Washington, he thought, well, this can't be true. I haven't received such an order. Then he was called to Paris, and he was given the order, spy on the Americans, find out all about their nuclear weapons. And then he realized, oh my gosh, it's true. French intelligence is controlled by the KGB. So he had to flee. He had to actually defect out of French intelligence, which he describes rather dramatically in the latter part of his book Lamia. People can look and read this. This is a biography of a real spy.
Yeah.
So it's like when you learn this history of how it really was in the Cold War, and yet you hear all this stuff about, the CIA ruled did all these shenanigans. No, who's really ruling the roost? The KGB. They penetrated the British, they penetrated the French, they penetrated the Americans, the Germans, of course.
We're gonna have to put a pin in it for right now. Can you send me a text, and can we schedule another one sooner than later? Because I'd like to continue this.
Oh yeah.
I'd like
Absolutely.
to go down the rabbit hole further.
Oh yeah, it's a huge rabbit hole. It's definitely.
It's still playing out today.
It is.
Guys, please go in the description. Please go follow him on Twitter. And Jeff, please send me a text, and let's get another one scheduled soon.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you for your time. As always, I love talking with you.
All right. Take care, Tommy.
Take care. Thank you so much.